And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the president of the Manitowish Waters Historical Society, Mr. Jim Bokrin.
Hi, and welcome to everybody on the Manitowish Waters Historical Society's maiden voyage on a Zoom presentation to up to 100 people. So we're excited about it, and we have a great topic: logging impacts on the Manitowish Waters area and land policies. I think you'll find this to be quite fascinating. Also, we really are looking for your feedback throughout this process on how it went. So we may be able to send you a survey or send us emails, and your suggestions would be most appreciated. But without any further ado, let's go explore logging impacts in Manitowish Waters and land policy. In our first slide, what we're witnessing is river drive logging, and that's where it all started. And a great quote from 1852, Representative Ben Eastman said that we had enough lumber supply for America for all time. And again, that was a bit of an overestimation. When we look at Manitowish Waters and logging, it starts right here at the Rest Lake Dam. And when you would be looking at the pea patch today from what is the parking lot of AB, or formerly Pine Barrens, you would see the dingle. That is the structure right here, which is the main area where the loggers stayed and the cook shanty was. That came from Maine, and they had been logging in Maine for 200 years up to that point. From the inception of this country, forest products and forestry were some of the most valued commodities. But you could actually see people on the gangplank going down to the river here. The sluice is opening and throwing water. And you'd look down Manitowish Waters downtown right through this area, and you see absolutely nothing. And we're going to explore the development of river drive logging and two other phases of logging in the area. Some modern scholars divide logging and lumber industry into three phases, and I kind of buy into that as well. One, what I just was showing you, the river drive logging of white pines, where they were running the cork pine or white pines downstream. Number two, railroad logging, the harvesting of remnant white pines, red pine, hardwoods, and other trees that don't float at all or not so well. And then finally, phase three, post-World War I, small logging camps using trucks, tractors, and some pulpwood logging as well. So we're going to follow that and the evolution of land ownership across the Northwoods. So with this model, here we go. Well, formal land policies for logging began with the treaties with the Ojibwe. And this is a large map showing several Ojibwe treaties all across the Great Lakes region. We're going to focus on two treaties. The 1837 pine tree treaty that would be in the goldenrod or yellow kind of color in this area. Trying to move my cursor around that for you. And that was not part of Manitowish Waters. We were right here. We were involved in the cession of land by the Ojibwa to the federal government. It was known as the Copper Treaty. Certainly logging was part of it, also mineral rights to the north of us. At this point, there was a transition of land ownership. And by 1854, treaties will establish the modern reservations of today, and the logging will begin. So 1854 is a pretty good date here. The Wisconsin Pinery Journal at Stevens Point reported that 50 years of logging would scarcely make an impression on the boundless forest. And taking a look at the right in this image right over here, and these stacked giant white pines with a gentleman right here at the bottom, you can see where they might have that impression. We all know that the level of industrialized logging will be much greater than that, and the forests will disappear at a much quicker rate. So when it all began in Manitowish Waters, as it did in other areas, we had two groups that began to survey the land. One would be timber cruisers, and the other would be the first surveyors. The image on the left is a timber cruiser moving through the woods. These men were amazingly adept at navigating the woods, mapping, and plotting the location of these grand stands of various kinds of trees that would then be sold. You can see the middle image right here. This is actually an old hemlock on a trail in Toy Lake Swamp that almost resembles perfectly this recreation here. But more importantly, to the right, we actually see that our early surveyors, also leaving marks on what were called witness trees, actually marked every section corner with several trees. And sometimes they kept these really cool notes, like this one regarding Rest Lake and Benson Lake. It says, in this township, a large amount of pine timber, much of which is valuable, will very soon be taken to market by floating down the streams, which are sufficient. This is an amazing document that is reinforced again by modern scholar Trigg. He ran the Trigg Map Company. And he illustrates right on Benson Lake and right on Rest Lake coming in where these trees were. The reason why I'm talking about this to such a degree, this survey was done in 1862. This was well before most of the lumber companies, and these gentlemen who were logging along these areas would be timber trespassing, to be sure, trying to get their slice of the American dream. But that predates a lot of starting dates that many scholars have for logging in the region. And you would think the lumber companies would get the first crack at the land, but that is not the case at all. The federal government had other ideas for the newly acquired land, and they were using land in lieu of cash to finance many of the government projects. The first one to the left, you see this kind of orange arrow. This shows a large tract of land that was given to the Sioux Line, Central Wisconsin Railroad line, ultimately, that went from Marshfield up to Ashland and beyond. And huge tracts of land were given for free to the railroads to subsidize their building. Right next to the town of Manitowish in the middle image, you can see, there it is, the Wisconsin Central Railroad. Ironically, the railroad that goes through Manitowish is the Northwest Railroad, which has land grants in another area. To the right, you see Cornell University. This is an interesting thing because one of the other areas they wanted to subsidize in the federal government were colleges. So let's go take a look at Cornell's work. The Morrill Land Grant was passed in 1862, and you wonder, what does that have to do with logging in northern Wisconsin? Well, by giving scrips, that means access to free land. Since New York was the most populous state, Cornell was able to acquire 499,000 acres of Chippewa Valley prime pine land, all of which would be sold and then used to finance the Cornell University in New York State. It's interesting that the state of Wisconsin early on, 1878, wanted to create a state park in what is Vilas County and parts of eastern Iron County to be a steward of resources. What I see here is also, when you look at the railroad land grants here on the left for the Sioux Line and on the right for Northwestern Railroad line, they both stayed away from the state park area. Interestingly, in 1897, the state legislature opened up all this land, and a bigger lumber boom than was previously going on was launched with very inexpensive land within the region. So as we've witnessed the land being turned over to federal interest with railroads and universities, agriculture universities, now we're going to transition into talking about the three phases of the logging. And the first phase is white pine logging and its impact in the regions. If you look at the right, you see two gentlemen who are putting bucking wedges in trees to try to drop a large white pine, and men on the left image were cutting the felled trees into large bolts. Those bolts of logs would then be loaded either onto ice sleds, as you see on the left, or being skidded on go devils by horses. I'd like you to take a look at the right image for later on, that large white pine bolt being dragged by chains behind those two horses. And look how high that is, 2 or 3 feet high. That'll be important as we get into the phase 3 logging in one of our new discoveries. So moving those logs, this image shows, and I'm sorry that it's grainy, I got it from a video. It shows logs that were decked along a river. If you look along the shoreline, brought there by those ice sleds and horses, and then ultimately they were skidded to the edge and skidded into the river as the upstream dams started to flood and roll the rivers downstream with the river rats controlling the logs. This was sometimes called flashing the logs. We can see in this 1879 document, they were driven or flashed downstream. And the habit of flashing these logs, they would use these smaller dams. This one has a sluice coming down the middle. Sometimes they didn't even have a sluice. They were just cutaway dams, and they were blown or opened up, and the water was poured down, ushering in all the logs. You can see the lumberjacks at the bottom standing on the cork pines or the white pines. As we look at the 1879 documentation, there were complaints down in Eau Claire that the dam operations upstream, that means the Manitowish Waters, was detrimental to the navigation below in Eau Claire. Literally, during the holdback period, the boats in Eau Claire and steamboats sat on the river bed, and then when they let these dams go, they flooded the town out. So in 1879, the Army Corps of Engineers made a huge effort to try to document some of the best dam sites and move the logs downstream. That brings us right to Rest Lake. And Rest Lake was cited as being one of the best dam sites in all of the upper Chippewa River. This image, as you see on the right, was part of the Allen expedition, and it is super detailed of Rest Lake and its measurements. What many people may find hard to believe, if you look at the right image here, is that the exit of Vance Lake, or Dam Lake, was actually the site for the first dam. If we look to the left, they would put a dam right across here, and then over that large hill to another area. We'll go to a blow-up image of it here on the next page. And this was a goal to get this, put a 25-foot head of water on Manitowish Waters. Currently in summertime, we hold back about 8 feet. Imagine what it would look like at 25 feet. Well, you don't have to imagine. These Army Corps of Engineer folks, under the guidance of Allen, actually drew maps showing you where the water line would have been had we dammed at 25 feet. If you look to the far right, you can see it would have been flooded all the way up to the Trout River Golf Course, and all of this would have been navigable. The chain would have been somewhat on the scale of the Turtle Flambeau flowage. And this was, again, because they knew that Rest Lake and the dam there would be a powerhouse for this river drive logging. For some unknown reason, in 1880, the legislature decided to lower the dam head, at Rest Lake from 25 to 15 feet. And the yellow arrow in the proposed dam was shifted to where the red arrow is, where the real dam operates today between the Pea Patch and Aurora Borealis. Likely, Peter Vance, the gentleman in the left, timber cruiser and one of the earliest settlers in the region, said, hey, you can build that dam faster with less money and not have to build this large dike over here between points B and C by just putting it on this part of the watershed. And they did. So the result of that is the Rest Lake Lumber Camp right in what would be the parking lot next to the river by the Pea Patch today. Here you can see it kind of weathered a little bit after the fact, not as fresh as that first picture that I showed you. But this dingle, this camp, was a feature of town for much of the early part of the 20th century. One of the other things that we've really found recently that's exciting about Manitowish Waters River Drive logging is that we found a site that is probably dealing with taking care of the draft animals, such as the oxen on the left or the horses on the right. Very important to skidding the logs, as I discussed. So right where the original dam was supposed to be, ironically, we see this large berm. If you look at the image on the right, you can see a rise of over 2 feet from the ground in this eye diagram that I put into the picture. And the arrow is pointing at a ball cap I was wearing at the time. And this was put around a very large area that was on an angle, probably for livestock, barbed wire in the area. Right now, you can go to the river, even though it's 7 below on my thermometer right now, that river is wide open. And even as you look at it in the summertime, vegetation still doesn't grow there because of whatever river drive logging activity took place there. It dramatically impacted the soil. So that is another strong Manitowish Waters River Drive connection right along the Discovery Center's hiking trails. Contrary to a lot of historians, local historians in the Manitowish Waters area who thought that the Chippewa Lumber and Boom Company ran the camp at Russ Lake Dam, it was actually the Mississippi River Logging Company. We're really splitting hairs here because both of these are part of the Weyerhaeuser Syndicate. Matter of fact, Weyerhaeuser had probably a half dozen companies, if you will, operating in the Northwoods and conducting his lumbering business. But during the heyday of the log drive, it was really the Mississippi River Logging Company. And Paul Brenner was the historian from Boulder Junction who kind of got a bead on that. Speaking of Boulder Junction, when we look at early dam operations of the Mississippi River Logging Company, the top picture is a dam along Boulder Lake on what is today Highway K. You can see the cribbing right here. The sluices aren't really running too well on the left, but there's one on the right. Go down below, there's the dam at Russ Lake, which was the mighty dam that held back enough water to drive most of these. And just north of the Boulder Dam, there was also one at Fish Trap Dam that held back water on High and Fish Trap Lakes. The long-term impact of the dam and the way it pushed water was amazing. They would raise the water 16 feet and release it all in a matter of weeks, scouring the chain. Here you can see some of the effects of twisted logs and lumber and stumps and eroded banks that were just below the dam on what is now Vance Lake today. It's interesting, just for those of you who have ever been on the chain and gone through the channels, in 1846, A.B. Gray came through in a geological expedition, and when he described the streams that connected the picturesque lakes in Manitowish Waters, he said they were beautiful and the streams were barely sufficient for the width of a canoe. That's how narrow our channels were before the dam. After the dam, the erosion was extraordinary. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the Russ Lake Dam in a separate presentation. But this is an impoundment. We're raising the water from 0 to as much as 16 feet. And on the lakes, the wood, the cork pine, the white pine have to be rafted. And right at the Russ Lake launch, just above the dam, here is the paddle wheel that would move the huge rafts of logs. First to the Russ Lake Dam to go through the sluice. And when the railroads finally hit the area in phase 2 logging, it will also raft the logs to those rail hoists. So here's the sluice on the left, moving the logs down into Dam Lake and in full operation. As you go further down the river, we can see the white pine starting to tie up in some of the turns. You can see a wanigan, which is a cookhouse that's a boat that the river rats would use with their battues to make their way down the river and get fed and taken care of. Almost immediately after the logs left Vance Lake, there's a bit of a dog leg in the river with some shallow water, and it's the Sturgeon Lake Rapids. And here's a picture of it all jammed up with a lot of white pine logs, and you can see this boom extending up here. This boom actually existed here for quite a while, according to longtime resident of this lake, Jody Miller, and the DNR took it out some time ago. But these log jams become problematic. If you can't pick them apart, they had a technique I like to call dynamite on a stick. And here's an image of it. If the river rat and the river running and the logging and the cold and the tools weren't dangerous enough, how about putting 4 or 5 sticks of dynamite on a pole, walking out on that jam, lighting the dynamite, shoving it down as far as you can, and trying to get out of the way. This is what it was like to be a river drive logger. And they would drive these logs all the way down to Chippewa Falls or the Mississippi River. Now, for a little bit of context, what we're looking at here is the orange arrow. That's Russ Lake and all the work that was going here in Manitowish Waters. It might be useful for us to go up and see our friends in Winchester and Mercer and see what logging was going on there, because they're also doing river drive logging as well. And doing some research in that area, they don't have a big dam like Russ Lake, but they have the Turtle, and they have several dams, like between Oxbow and Spider Lake, Spider and Fisher Lake, Rice and Pike Lake, and also down around Lake of the Falls. And they would drive their logs very effectively. Here's a modern image of a Shays Dam named after one of the earliest loggers in the Mercer area. It still exists today. But if we look at the 1900 map by Fayette Buck, you can see an old logging dam here right between Oxbow and Spider Lake, as I described before. Also, you see a little path here because they're only walking up to Winchester at this point. Flip ahead from 1900 to 1905. Notice this map here in the upper right. That path is replaced with a railroad. And now we're going to move into some railroad logging. But both railroad logging and river drive logging operated simultaneously. This is kind of a fascinating outcome. And here we see some of our friends in Mercer doing river drive logs as well, and some of the accommodations they lived in. So just imagine this. We have logs coming from different logging companies from Manitowish Waters. They're coming off of the Turtle River. They're also going to be coming down the North Fork of the Flambeau, then the South Fork of the Flambeau, and then the Chippewa River will kick in. How do you keep them all straight? Well, it's almost like cowboys in the American West. Instead of a heated brand, they used a stamp hammer. And on this softer wood, it worked really well. They would actually incise the logging company's symbol, just like a ranch out in Montana, and they would hammer the logs several times, and then this timber, or these logs, would be scaled at the mills, and the right logging company would be paid. Now, when we start talking about the logging camps themselves, they vary dramatically, and the experiences vary dramatically as well. We've been lucky in some of our research to be able to find some 1895 documentation from Western United States dime novelist E. Huff from Chicago. Somewhat hyperbolic, like many dime novelists of the time depicting the American West. He was with Fayette Buck doing some winter trapping. But he got a treat to be in Woodruff, Wisconsin, to pick up a camera and saw just the debauchery of the logging towns in this area. Notice the highlighted one. The logging town is low, sodden, degraded, and does not rise to the dignity of wickedness. Up above, he has some other less flattering things to say about the loggers here, saying they're much worse than the Western frontier. But that was one kind of camp. Some camps were run by families. Some were large businesses with a great deal of control. These logging camps were quite varied. So if we take a look at the right, here you have the Mississippi River logging camp that is a river drive camp at Rest Lake. And at the left, this is the Turtle Lake lumber camp that's in Winchester, Wisconsin. Here you see the hot pond right next to the mill area. And again, this was more of a company town kind of model. If we look at these company towns, the one that we have the best documentation on is really up in what is today Presque Isle, also known as Fosterville or Weingar. The Vilas County Lumber Company operated there, and as a company town, that means you're paid with company money. You're not even given U.S. currency for your work. So your rent, your home, your food, it all evolves around the large company town. Also, Yawkey Bissell had a company town in those kind of currencies as well, that they were operating in Arborvitae and other regions. But these big, massive, muscular towns don't represent, and mills don't represent truly the full experience. And I think it's time for us to focus on some of the small logging families that really typify the pioneers of the Manitowish Waters area. We're going to focus on Henry and Susan Laporte, but it could have just as easily have been Richard Slate or Abe Lefebvre or Robert Lovelace or others. But we have a lot of good pictures and great research here. So here they are, Henry and Susan Laporte, and Ruth Gardner, who runs Voss's and is a great historian of the area, indicated that her family was right there at Rest Lake Dam in 1889, working at the Mississippi River Logging Company. The Laportes worked as timber cruisers, cooks, loggers, builders, blacksmiths, later guides, and did other work. Here is the Laporte family at their homestead. On the left, you see Emil Winnetka there also from Little Bohemia. But they were from Marathon County, and they traveled up here seasonally. And they worked in every form of logging business and were super ambitious. They were really quite transient. Joyce Labs, 1978, interviewed George Laporte. And he gave us an amazing insight that's really hard for me to get my head around. Down below it says, it was a nomadic life for the Laporte family. In fact, George figured he had moved some 53 times with this family after he was 4 years old. So he came to Manitowish in his mid-teens. So that's a lot of moving for one family. But I think that was typical of a lot of the families and their operations within this area, and did not suffer the debauchery that we heard from E.F. Huff, and did not work in a company town. They were more of the independent logging families, and frankly, the ones who stuck here, like the Lefebvres, like the Slates. So if we take a look at Manitowish, was kind of a gateway to a lot of the families in Manitowish Waters and in Mercer. We have a lot of interesting traditions there. If you want to take a look in the upper part of this, this is an old ice road marked in yellow. Goes all the way down to this landing here on the Manitowish River. I left the yellow arrow off here because on a modern aerial photo, you can still see the ice road where they would be skidding all of those pine bolts here and decking them. Here's where that homestead for the resort or the Laportes were. And then down below, they even had their own river landing here. That's flanked by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad that brought in all the phase 2 logging. Interestingly, the Slates owned this part of Manitowish, and that was part of their family's operations. The Doriots and other families within the region all were part of this phase 2 logging effort. So here's what the homestead looked at of Laporte's. It was quite an operation. As I said, this is an ambitious family doing a great deal of work. Now, when we start talking about the families, as I've been sharing, we have to understand that they faced many challenges as far as becoming part of the Northwoods as landowners and not just itinerant loggers. Some of the local pioneers would sometimes access the lumber of other people and try to take that to market from time to time to capture their slice of the American dream. Because people like Cornell and Weyerhaeuser and other logging companies really didn't allow them that kind of access. If you look at really all the different corporations like F.I. Carpenter right here in section 16, that's a huge mining corporation. They were controlling much of the land, and very few family names are on this 1913 plat map. As we look at the land policies and manipulation, back taxes, and competing claims, the pioneering families of the Devines, the Ilges, Peter Vance, the Lefebvres, and the Laportes all had challenges in regard to their ownerships and claims. And they were here from the 1880s and the 1890s. And many of these were hurtful because of really the loose handling and exchange of lands between the different ownership groups. And these folks figured they were entitled to their homesteads, and ultimately they were. But some of these were not even resolved until the 1930s. So moving back to phase two logging, when we start to get the railroads in this area, they're accessing the hardwoods here, as you can see on the right, and coming through the town of Manitowish. There were basically two railroads that accessed Manitowish Waters, and they were only tertiary routes, and we really never had a big depot ever in Manitowish Waters. To the south and then to the west, it was the Northwestern Railroad. Here's a train from Weingar right here. To the north and to the east, it was the Milwaukee Road. And here is a railroad going over Star Creek. Manitowish Waters was 7.5 miles away from the major rail stop in Manitowish. Below, you see this is the old water ski site for the skiing skeeters right across from Aurora Borealis. And this was the landing that people would go and be dropped off from when they went to the station in Manitowish. So as you look at it, here's the railroad going to Manitowish Station. You have 7.25 miles to get here to the dam. It seems like it would be a pretty short river drive, wouldn't it, to the railroad? So with the railroad station on Rest Lake, only 7 or so miles away, why did Weyerhaeuser drive his logs all the way to the Chippewa, down the Chippewa River as far as Mississippi? I posed that question to lumber historian John Berg, and he quickly responded, money and power. Weyerhaeuser was not going to pay the railroads and not going to give away his power as a lumber baron, and he would happily hire river rats and loggers to drive the logs downstream, even though he may have attrition of 30% or more on a logging drive of hung up logs and lost logs. And then to the lower part of this, you see here the railroad that comes off of the region of the Northwest Railroad at Powell and comes to Star Lake. This is really fun and one of the most dramatic images we have right in Manitowish Waters. Inside of Little Bohemia's dining room on Powell Lake Road, that's where this picture was taken, between Little Star Lake and the Stepping Stone Lakes. This was operated by the Flambeau Lumber Company, but others leased this railroad route. That whole beautiful bay there was filled with red pine, brought there by the same steamship that was moving the white pines earlier. These red pines were drawn into this area. The red pines float okay, but that's why there were thousands of these sprinkled all over lakes in Manitowish Waters, and many are still there, because a lot of them didn't get to the hoist. There were 3 hoists along the area. But here you see the large boom on the left. They're putting them in on the rail cars, and they're moving them out. The detail, the accuracy, this actually came from the Sorvold collection. We just got it a couple of years ago. Now, moving to the eastern and northern railroad that was accessing this area. You see it marked here by the yellow arrow. It's important to point that this map shows both the Milwaukee Road by the yellow arrow, and to the south and the west, the Northwest Railroad trunks. They were both racing to get to the areas of Manitowish Waters, Presque Isle, and Winchester, because those are the last really great stands of timber that were left to access. And we'll look at some of those lumber companies very closely in just a moment. So the train engine on the car could actually drag a loader, and this is what they used as a hoist on Rice Creek. This isn't actually from Rice Creek, but it would be an example of a hoist that would be used there, right where Kate Newcomb, the angel on snowshoes, will later create her home. In Weingart, Fosterville, and Winchester, in those larger lumber company towns, they literally would take the lumberjacks out with their own mess halls that were built into the cars and sleeping quarters, expanding their ability to log throughout the seasons, not just being restricted to winter logging as they were with white pine logging. Here's the Turtle Lake Lumber Company. I've shown you this before, but it was another impressive logging company that operated into the 1920s. And again, this is the Vilas Lumber Company in Fosterville, Weingart, or today Presque Isle. Here's a really good example of the Milwaukee Road that runs all the way up to Papoose Junction. That's about where North Lakeland Elementary School is. And then it would move to the logging area of Buswell. After that, they also ran Yawkey-Bissell, a line right into Rest Lake, right between Camp Jordan and Serban Park, on the other side of Serban Park, and that's known as Riley Hoist. And a lot of logs were moved from this area as well. But we're going to focus on Buswell because that's really quite an exciting story. And again, you see here, right here on Clear Lake, here's Buswell, and to the right is a fabulous map drawn by John Lefebvre, son of Abe Lefebvre, and he operated resorts on Island Lake all of his life. And starting in 1905, Buswell was a growing community with a great deal of promise. The railroad tax came in, whole families were moving in, buildings, the large sawmill, a hot pond with the railroad going over the top of it, a track to raise the logs into the sawmill. It was quite a promising and prospering operation. Here you can see logs being brought in by rail, dropped into the hot pond right off of the cars there. Beneath this, you can see the images of Buswell itself, of the school, the different buildings and alike. Sadly, Buswell was devastated by a fire in July of 1910. This fire came through, as many fires did within this period, that plagued the Northwoods and ravaged the town. 200 to 300 town members were displaced. We're going to record this and put it online later. You can read all of this if you want to pick it up on our YouTube channel later. But they sent a rescue train in to save the people of Buswell, but the bridge had already burnt down and the train was sent back. The folks from Buswell had to run into the waters of Papoose Lake and barely survived either the flames or the suffocation of the smoke. So Buswell was gone. Interestingly, 1 year later, the Wisconsin Department of Forestry, which started in 1904, led by E.M. Griffith, was poised and ready to combat these terrible and raging fires. Here is a picture of the construction phase of the Rest Lake Ranger Station. With the ranger cabin here, they're still putting tar paper and shingles on one of the outbuildings here. Here's a bunkhouse for the men who would suppress the fire. Here's the hill above this is the site of Angler's Restaurant today. And they used windmills supports to put towers up there. That's a 70-foot tower that they could look for fire, and they would put in phone lines so they could phone them back. You can imagine the people in the area were happy to have a systematic means in which to fight the fires that had been so devastating before in the region of Buswell. It's notable that at Trout Lake, they built the major headquarters, and another satellite ranger station was right by the dam on Highway K by Boulder Lake, and that was the Boulder Ranger Station. And these men could heroically converge on fires and work with locals to try to stop tragedies like Buswell from happening again. So if we look at our Winchester neighbors to the north, it really shows the huge blocks of Turtle Lake and Buswell and the Flambeau Lumber Company owning these areas, and F.I. Carpenter, the mining corporation controlling most of the land, getting back to that monopoly kind of landscape that I spoke of before. But as time goes on, the land will sell and it will begin to transition. Land with back taxes sometimes goes to the state. Also, there could be private interests or people who wanted to get some of the Northwoods land. You could purchase it for just back taxes. That's why early pioneers had trouble, because sometimes with back taxes, somebody could come along and try to pick off your property, which was a frustration. We're going to move to our final phase now, phase 3 logging. We're concluding the railroad logging, but I do want to comment that during phase 3 logging, there was still railroad logging going on. This is a transition that was really underway right around World War I and into the 1920s. We have some great examples in the Manitowish Waters area of phase 3 logging, and it's growing. To the left is the Loveless sawmill on Alder Lake with a track system to move lumber and alike, and we'll get into that. To the right is a relation of Loveless and Boulder Junction, the Cassine family going out and doing the kind of pulpwood cutting in the post-cutover era. And these are classic examples of smaller logging operations that occurred. Want to take a look at Loveless to begin with. You can take a look at the plat map to the left. You see here Robert Loveless here, Robert Loveless here, and around Alder Lake, almost a perfect diagram of his pine lands. Notice how he didn't cut his trees. It's a great irony. He runs the best phase 3 sawmill in the area, and he has his virgin forest park for his resort. So he resists cutting his own trees to create different entrepreneurial opportunities. So if you look at Alder Lake, the yellow arrow shows where Loveless had his sawmill, and the green arrow was where he had his giant pavilion built in 1924. And he would have hundreds of people come here, and they would listen to musical bands dance and enjoy refreshments others didn't have access to during Prohibition. If we take a look more on Loveless's property, he ran a resort here. He had his sawmill right here at the exit of Alder Lake and the outlet of the Trout River, where the no wake buoy is, roughly. And this was his hot pond where he would move in his trees and run into his lumber mill. Here's an example of Loveless in running his sawmill before he even had a building around it and piling up lumber right next to that hot pond area. Later, by 1920, he's got a whole building around it. You can see the hot pond here in Alder Lake. You can see the old lengths of logs, the bolts laying here, and the track that leads right into his phase 3 lumber mill. And again, not only was the hot pond used, but this corridor right here is where locals could bring and skid in their logs into his hot pond area, and then he'd put it into his lumber mill and mill their lumber. So if you look at it today, if you're in your pontoon boat, this is the hot pond area just before the buoys on the left. You can see a V in the trees where they were dragging the logs through on the horizon line. And right here is about where the sawmill was. You can see the tailing piles from all the leftover elements of his milling operation here, and to the right of the boathouse and all the boats that was there for his resort. Again, an ambitious gentleman. Ultimately, Lovelace was not satisfied keeping his logging company here. Once Highway 51 came into the area, or Highway 10 here, he moved that logging camp out next to what is now the Howling Dog Saloon, the tavern he also operated, and that logging operation was out there into the 1940s and the 1950s. One of the last things we're going to be going over here, which is really fun and is a brand new mystery, is a Phase 3 logging camp just north of Circle Lily Lake. That's about a half-mile north of the township of Manitowish Waters. If you look right here, you can see the yellow arrow, and it shows next to Toy Lake where this logging camp is. And the road comes in, you can see the piled lumber and all the activity in this area. We're thinking that this was operating probably about in 1935 into the 1940s. But what was really exciting that we have just got our heads around recently is this Phase 3 logging mystery that is taking place on a trail on the east side of Circle Lily Lake. Going through, we have found 12 of these tern trees. These are mostly hemlock, some cedar. And I went out with my measuring post the other day, and you can see right along here where there are rubs from cables where they were pulling the logs through the snow and whipping them around these trees. I recently have been working with a gentleman from Eagle River named Kent Ecker, who's an expert in moving equipment in the woods, logging and alike, and has spent a lot of time in the UP. And he said, yeah, those are tern trees. Those are usually cut down afterwards, and they're just areas where they were skidding material out of the woods where they would just rough up the tree with the cables and the bolt. Remember I asked you earlier to take a look at those horses dragging that single bolt of white pine and think about how high that was. So if you look at this, I had my little measuring pole out there. The cables were crossing at 6 feet consistently, and they were knocking bark off here. So they're running a tractor or dozer. They're compacting the snow to 4 feet, and they're damaging the trees here. There was a heck of a lot of snow in these woods, and they were moving a lot of bolts from the trees they were cutting through, and have left us a little trail of breadcrumbs, if you will. Now, as we go on, I talked to Ken and with his expertise, and he said, I'm sure they were using Oliver cleat track tractors. So I found a picture of a 1941 cleat track, and it really comes to a neat mystery that we have along this skid line. So here is my little pole again, where we have a white pine that's been cut off, and it's not like the old white pines is too intact. So it's probably part of this Phase 3 logging. But what's really strange is, notice the yellow arrow here and here is marking under the snow a huge bolt. That means the upper part of this pine tree, the most valuable part, that was left behind. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But what probably occurred is this Oliver cleat track was a little outmatched for the size of this lumber, and they couldn't move it. That moves us to our next thing. Just up the trail from that is this giant remnant white pine, 43 inches in diameter, skying out of the forest floor, much, much bigger than the bolt that was left behind. So it appears to me that ultimately they broke down and couldn't finish the job, couldn't cut the tern trees, couldn't cut these larger white pines. And as a result, we have some legacy pines, which is kind of a microcosm of early logging here in Wisconsin that's really a fun place to visit. Hidden along the skid trail, we found something else. On an old hemlock, there was this marking. Have any of you ever seen that before? You don't have to answer now. Do you know why this mark was left and why? Well, this is kind of a tease. This is kind of a mark that's left behind for maybe another presentation about forestry. That SP stands for a sample point. And those I've found in a couple places across the Northern Highland Forest. And this is where researchers and scientists who are foresters and wildlife and water specialists go out and take data points to try to learn and mark the growth of the forest. The Toy Lake Swamp is a state natural area, and it is a gem, to be sure. So if you ever want to learn more about forestry and those operations, we have a rich legacy there. Well, as we come to a conclusion here, I guess I'd like to review those 3 phases and look at it through the lake I live on, Alder Lake. Let's start with the red arrows. This would be River Drive logging. Here we have an example of a tugboat on Big Trout Lake moving a big raft of logs. And Paul Brenner documented those were driven down the Trout River, through Wild Rice Lake, and then with the paddle wheel, as you see in the lower left here, they would be dragged from Alder Lake all the way to the dam and flushed down the river with river rats all the way to Chippewa Falls. Let's go to the yellow arrow. You may not have known this, but there was actually a narrow gauge spur that came right to the campsites on Alder Lake Park Road, and they were loading their logs onto this as they did on Little Star Lake. And we had railroad phase 2 logging here. And as I have shared proudly, the blue phase, we have the Lovelaces right here with his hot pond and his phase 3 logging camp right in this area. So our legacy in Manitowish Waters is great. And for my last slide, I guess I want to leave with the Lovelace family. Robert Lovelace broke the stranglehold of lumber companies and speculators on pioneers, and he bought land in 1910 and 1909 to create his Virgin Forest Park and establish his pioneering family here in Manitowish Waters, experiencing all 3 phases. Well, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. This is our first swing at a Zoom meeting, and we put in about 50 minutes on it, which was our goal, and we would be able to open ourselves for questions.
Pretty good, Jim. We have a few questions. You can pull up your chat box if you want to see them, but I'll just read them for everybody. Jim, can you still see evidence of any railroad beds anywhere in Manitowish Waters?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, we're documenting those with the state right now, so they'll be protected in the long term. We're protecting one of the 3 hoists on the chain that is in outstanding shape. There are also numerous railroad beds on both public and private land. And we're really quite fortunate that some of the private landowners are very much aware of that and are very protective and are stewards of those cultural resources. So I'm happy to report that yes, and we have some really good remnants.
So Jim, is that something that will eventually let people know where those are?
Well, we have to work with either the private landowner and we have to work with the DNR, Craig Dalton, the property manager for the Northern Highland American Legion Forest, Richard Kubicek, who is the historic preservation officer for the DNR. Both of those men have been just absolutely supportive of our efforts and want to promote education and sharing these resources. But we got to be smart about it because they're fragile and we can't really lose any more.
Right. And it's a good thing you said Craig's a great guy because he's listening in.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Jim, what were some of the destinations for all of our lumber?
Well, it depends. The destination is first the mill, and then after the mill, they went all over the Midwest and the West. A lot of the lumber from this area built the cities of the Midwest, Chicago, St. Louis. I mean, there are reports that some of the white pines from Wisconsin, from those Cornell lands, made it to Alton, Illinois, which is, to be milled across from St. Louis. But a lot of this material also went out to areas like in Kansas that didn't have a lot of lumber as well. We had great proximity and we had great river infrastructure, and it allowed for the transfer of the lumber once the logs were taken from areas like Manitowish Waters in a very broad spectrum of the Midwest.
Jim, can you tell us what happened specifically to the loveless virgin pine trees?
Well, a lot of them are still there. I look at them every day out of my window. There has been some logging on that property, but much of it is still very much intact, and it's really a treasure along the chain.
Right. Seems like a lot of the families involved in logging also ran resorts, some of which still exist today. Can you talk a little bit about the clientele of these resorts?
Well, the clientele varied. That's an awesome question. That's a presentation in itself. And, we might just do that here pretty quick. But when you think about resorts, you have to start from the beginning. And the early resorts were basically just tent camps and lumber camps and these early sportsmen fishing and hunting. And then it evolved into modest buildings and then really into more grand resorts. There's a real evolution. And of the big resorts within the Manitowish chain, there was actually, active competition between each of these resorts, and they were immensely popular. And a lot of folks came from Chicago, but all over the country. And it grew quite quickly.
I'll do a little tease here. We're working on our March newsletter, which is around the corner, and we'll be looking. Our theme for this issue will be the Roaring 20s. So we'll be looking 100 years back, and we'll talk a little bit about the resorts from the 1920s in there. So you'll see some of those names specifically. Jim, you talked about the turn trees and the sample point. Obviously, blazes. Are there other things that when you're out there hiking in the woods, other things to give us a heads up on that we should be looking for out there?
Well, when you find things and you're looking for them, whether you're on public property, your own property, or, especially if you're on somebody else's private property, these are fragile resources, but they're also fun. You can always take a picture of them with your camera and report them to somebody who can give you an idea of what's the best thing to do as far as preservation. I recommend that. But as I take people out on some of the tours that I do with the North Lakeland Discovery Center, we're going to actually do a toy lake hike in March. You can look for that. If you'd like to go out and see those turn trees, I'll take you there. But berms are usually part of the structure of logging camps, and they are really quite revealing. And a berm is just basically, I showed you a picture with my hat on it, is a raised area where soil was thrown up against either vertical or horizontal logs to keep bugs, wind, cold, and snow out of an area and make it more secure. But it tends to leave a signature. Not all camps use those kinds of berms, though. For instance, the railroad camp that we're going to be documenting in Manitowish Waters, which is on a railroad grade, it operated seemingly where it just ran a couple of railroad cars in there, kind of like how I showed you with the Turtle Lake Lumber Company and Vilas Lumber Company, where they could have everything on the rail cars, and when they're done, they just haul the rail cars out and their camp goes with them. But yeah, we actually find, railroad rails, the metal rails and things like that on trees. Oh, go on.
I've got another question, Jim. What point did the logging operation at Rest Lake Dam, when was it replaced with the fish hatchery?
The fish hatchery was a unique phenomena, and it didn't replace it. It was put beneath it, but it was the first municipal fish hatchery and was a prototype for the state that was expanded dramatically during the Great Depression. And it was a progressive partnership between government and locals to make sure that tourists would come to the area because we'd have fabulous fishing. That started about 1932 and then expanded to a lot of other sites based on the success of Manitowish Waters. The fish lock at the same time to move fish over the dams. It was called the bar fish lock. That was actually attached to the dam. So there's a lot of activity beneath the dam in that period, but that's all post-logging.
Right. Great.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I don't show any more questions. We're a little bit after 8, so I think we'll wrap it up. We want to thank everybody for joining us. This is a little experiment for us. So if you can send feedback to us at mwhistoricalsociety@gmail.com, you can get that off our website as well. Tell us what you thought about the presentation itself, informational, interesting. Tell us if you thought this length of time was appropriate for the presentation and what you thought about using the Zoom technology. So if you could give us some feedback, we really appreciate it. And we'll take that into consideration as we continue to fine tune our efforts here. So thanks for everybody. Of course, if you're not a member, please consider becoming a member. And we're always open to donations as we further our projects. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time.